Samuel Chun adjusted his data slate for the third time, the smooth surface gleaming in the filtered light of the chamber. The lines of text swam before his eyes, but he kept scrolling, forcing the words into his memory. Greeting customs, hierarchy protocols, ceremonial phrasing. 6 months of stalled trade talks had led to this moment. One meeting. One chance to tip the scales toward alliance instead of collapse. And somehow it all hinged on him. He drew in a slow breath and glanced around the chamber, letting its grandeur press down on him like a physical weight. Soaring walls of crystalline glass arched overhead, bending light into fractal rainbows that danced across the polished floor. Veilian artistry was everywhere, flowing banners etched with sigils so intricate they seemed alive, curling like threads of starlight in an invisible breeze. Even the air smelled curated, faintly metallic with undertones of something floral, and sharp like a scent designed to remind guests they were not at home. Samuel's pulse picked up as his gaze swept over the guards stationed in precise symmetry along the walls. Their armor shimmered like molten silver, layered plates etched with glowing runes that pulsed faintly with energy. They looked as if they had stepped out of myth-tall, elegant, and radiating a quiet lethality. A single twitch from any of them, and he'd be little more than a historical footnote, the human interpreter who failed in the moment that mattered most. Dr. Chun. Ambassador Rodriguez's low voice broke through his thoughts. Samuel turned, finding the ambassador's line. Face calm, but his eyes shadowed with the same worry Samuel felt clawing at his insides. Rodriguez leaned in slightly, keeping his words for Samuel alone. One last reminder, the Empress values directness. Say what you mean. Don't bury it in ceremony. Samuel nodded, clutching the slate a little tighter. Understood. Good. Rodriguez's gaze flicked toward the towering double doors at the far end of the chamber, their surfaces carved from some pale, opalescent material that seemed to glow from within. Because if this fails, his voice dropped to a whisper that barely reached Samuel's ears. It won't just be trade we lose. Samuel didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. These talks were a fragile bridge over an abyss of mistrust. If it collapsed, they wouldn't just lose resources, they'd lose the fragile piece that had held for barely a decade. And he was standing on the bridge's thinnest point. He checked the time on his slate again. Any second now. His stomach felt like it was folding in on itself. He forced himself to breathe evenly, rehearsing the greeting in his head one last time. Not too deep a bow. Hold it for 3 heartbeats, not 4. And for Star's sake, don't mispronounce her title. Sound came like a ripple through still water, a soft chiming, like glass struck gently by a silver rod. The doors began to part, the scene glowing brighter before splitting wide. Samuel straightened instinctively, his throat dry, every nerve taut with expectation. Light spilled into the chamber from the hall beyond, a light that seemed alive, soft blues and pale violets refracting through unseen prisms. And then she appeared. Empress Lyra Kyra crossed the threshold with a grace that didn't belong to mortals, her long ceremonial robes whispering over the polished floor as though gravity had agreed to release her, just a little. Her skin shimmered, faintly under the light, blue-tinted like the sky before dawn, and her crown, a delicate circlet of interwoven crystal threads, it pulsed with a glow that seemed to respond to her heartbeat. Her eyes, deep violet and impossibly clear, swept the chamber with quiet command, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Samuel's pulse thundered in his ears. He'd studied hundreds of images, read thousands of words about her culture, her lineage, her titles, but none of it prepared him for the raw presence that walked toward him now. This was not ceremony. This was sovereignty. And as her gaze found his, lingering for the barest second longer than protocol required, Samuel had the strangest, most unsettling feeling. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be about trade, At all, not the doors. Closed behind her with a resonant chime that echoed like a bell of fate. Asterisk, the Empress did not hurry. Each step she took across the chamber felt deliberate, as though the polished floor itself had to earn the privilege of her presence. Samuel swallowed hard and lowered his gaze in time with Ambassador Rodriguez, performing the bow exactly as he had practiced. Not too deep, 3 heartbeats. He rose when she gestured gracefully, her robe shifting in colors like flowing auroras. Ambassador. Rodriguez, she said, her voice a melody wrapped in authority. The translator nodes barely altered her tone, leaving it with the Veilian lilt that made each word sound like part of a song. And Dr. Chun, her eyes settled on Samuel. He felt the weight of that gaze as something more than observation. It was appraisal, silent questions brushing against his thoughts like ghostly fingertips. Thank you for accepting our invitation. The honor is ours, your Imperial Majesty, Rodriguez replied smoothly, though Samuel caught the faint tightness around his mouth. We are hopeful that today's discussion will move us beyond the remaining obstacles. The Empress inclined her head, but her lips curved in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Indeed, she said, though I believe our discussions today may cover more ground than simple commerce. Samuel felt his chest tighten. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but before he could speak, a sound floated across the chamber soft, unexpected and utterly out of place. A giggle. Light and unrestrained, it chimed like water over crystal, echoing through the vaulted space. The guards reacted instantly, shoulders stiffening, hands brushing weapon hilts with mechanical precision. Samuel froze, instinct screaming that something was wrong, even as curiosity pulled his eyes toward. A sound dot, it came from a smaller door off to the side, one Samuel had assumed was decorative. Now it slid open with a muted sigh, revealing a figure no one had expected. A child. She was small, no taller than Samuel's waist, her steps quick and unbothered by the gravity of the chamber. Skin the same ethereal blue as the Empress, though. Softer, untouched by the years that gave Lyra her quiet strength. Her hair gleamed like black silk, braided with threads of silver that caught the light with every movement. And her eyes, deep violet, luminous with curiosity, seemed to hold galaxies of thought far older than her years. Zara, the Empress said, her voice smooth but edged with something Samuel couldn't read. You were told to wait in your chambers. But Mama, the little girl replied, the translator softening her words into innocence while preserving their music. I heard voices. I wanted to see. Samuel's mouth went dry. Mama, his mind stumbled over the word. The Empress had a child. Somehow, no briefing document had prepared him for this. The girl moved deeper into the room with fearless grace, her simple dress glittering faintly with embedded crystals. Samuel noticed the guards exchange uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene. But the Empress merely lifted one elegant hand, a silent command holding the entire room still. Zara's gaze swept over the gathered figures, Rodriguez, the guards. The vast emptiness of the chamber before landing on Samuel Dot, and stayed there. Something shifted in her expression, like recognition striking a bell in her soul. Her lips parted in wonder, then curved into a smile so radiant it felt like sunrise. Slowly, deliberately, she raised one small finger and pointed straight at him. Mom, she said sweetly, her voice carrying clear and bright into the hushed chamber. That's him. Silence fell like a shroud. Even the air seemed to freeze. Every guard stiffened, their eyes flicking between the child, the Empress, and the human now standing motionless under the weight of a dozen stares. Rodriguez turned sharply toward Samuel. Confusion etched deep into his features. Samuel's throat constricted. What does that even mean? His mind scrambled for logic, but all he could hear was the echo of her words, ringing in his skull. That's him, The Empress's violet eyes did not move from her daughter's face. But Samuel saw something flicker there, something too complex to name. Hope. Fear. A shadow of grief so deep it chilled the blood. "Zara," she said gently, though her voice carried an undertone, like steel drawn across stone. "Return to your chambers." "No," the child replied without hesitation, her gaze never leaving Samuel. Her voice, still soft, held a conviction that sent a shiver down his spine. "He's here. The kind man from my dreams." Samuel felt his grip on the data slate falter. It slipped through his fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound loud in the oppressive stillness. Dreams? His pulse thundered. Something inside him whispered that this, whatever this was, nothing to do with trade agreements or cultural protocols, and everything to do with a truth he didn't yet understand. The Empress rose from her throne in a single, fluid motion, the glow of her crown intensifying like a heartbeat quickening. When she spoke, her voice was calm but layered with meaning. "Ambassador Rodriguez," she said without looking at him, "you will be escorted to the guest quarters." "Your Majesty," Rodriguez began, voice sharp with protest. "I don't think it's appropriate to this matter," Lyra interrupted softly, "concerns Dr. Chun alone." Two guards moved toward the ambassador. For a heartbeat, Samuel considered speaking up, insisting that Rodriguez stay. But the words died in his throat when the Empress's gaze finally turned fully on him. Deep violet, bright as starlight, and behind them, a storm he couldn't name. "We have much to discuss," she said. Samuel swallowed hard, his heartbeat loud enough to drown out thought. Whatever was coming, he sensed it would change everything, not just for him, but for two worlds. And as Zara smiled at him with a quiet certainty of prophecy, Samuel realized with a sick, surreal clarity, this meeting had never truly been about trade. It was about him. Asterisk. The doors closed behind Ambassador Rodriguez with a whisper like distant chimes, leaving Samuel in a silence that seemed alive. He felt the weight of the chamber pressing on him, the towering crystalline walls, the pale banners etched with alien sigils, the guards whose presence now felt like the edge of a blade against his skin. Across the room, the Empress stood like a statue carved from dawnlight, her violet eyes fixed on him. Beside her, Zara clasped her small hands behind her back, rocking slightly on her heels with the unconcerned ease of a child who had just shattered a diplomatic protocol older than Samuel's entire career. Samuel cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the hush. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carefully level despite the icy thread running down his spine. "I believe there's been some mistake." "I don't—" "There is no mistake," Zara interrupted softly. Her voice was like the echo of laughter in a quiet hall, light but certain. "It's you." Samuel froze, staring at her. Something in her tone, a conviction beyond her years, clawed at the edges of his reason. The Empress moved toward him, with the slow grace of a tide, her robes whispering against the floor. Samuel fought the urge to step back. He'd read entire volumes on Veilian authority, their subtle signals of power, but none of those studies prepared him for the raw presence radiating from her now. When she stopped a few feet away, the air between them seemed charged. "Dr. Chun," she said softly, though her words carried the weight of judgment, "do you recall receiving my invitation?" "Yes," Samuel managed. It specified that this would be a trade discussion. Her lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "That was not untrue," she said, "but it was not the whole truth." Samuel swallowed, his throat dry as ash. "Then what is the truth?" Before the Empress could answer, Zara slipped forward with the fearless confidence only children and fools possess. She stopped directly before Samuel, tilting her head back to look at him. Her violet eyes shimmered, ancient and innocent all. "At once, you told me stories, she said simply, as though recounting something obvious. About oceans and snow. About a place called Earth. Samuel felt the world lurch beneath him. What? You said snowflakes melt if you hold them too long, Zara continued, her voice soft with wonder. And that humans catch them on their tongues, just to laugh. Every hair on Samuel's body seemed to rise. He'd told someone those exact words before, but not her, not a child he'd never met. He tried to speak, but his voice fractured. I've never. Yes, you have. Zara's tone was gentle, almost pitying. You said humans and Veilians could be friends if we just talked to each other. You promised you'd help. Samuel's breath came shallow. He searched his memory, desperate for logic, but all he found were faint, fractured images, conversations in dim corridors, a deep voice asking questions about humanity, laughter shared over something as absurd as dessert. The Empress's voice drew him back like a taut wire. Zara, she said softly, tell Dr. Chun when these dreams began. The little girl turned her face toward her mother, then back to Samuel. Her words dropped into the silence, like stones into still water. The night my father died. Samuel's stomach hollowed. He stared at her, the sound of his own pulse thunderous in his ears. The Empress's expression shifted, just a flicker, but it was enough to peel back the mask of perfect composure. Beneath it lay grief, raw and deep, and something else. Hope. So fragile it seemed like glass. Your Majesty, Samuel whispered, the formal title breaking against the weight of questions in his throat. What is happening here? Lyra stepped closer until the glow of her crown bathed his face in violet light. Her voice, when it came, was almost a whisper, but each word seemed etched into stone. My daughter, she said, has been dreaming about you for 3 months. Dreams so detailed they could not be imagination. And Dr. Chun, her gaze pierced through him, sharp as starlight. They began the very night her father fell in battle. Samuel felt the air drain from the room. His knees threatened to give way. The name came before he could stop it, rising from the depths of memory like a ghost. Kale, he murmured. Zara's eyes widened with sudden joy. You do remember. Samuel staggered back a step, his mind spinning, the edges of reality fraying like torn silk. He remembered now the mission, the conversations, the bond forged in fire and duty. And with that memory came the cold shattering realization. Whatever was happening here wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message from the dead. And Samuel had just become part of it. Samuel stood frozen in the center of the crystalline chamber, the name he had just spoken hanging in the air like the sound of a cracked bell. Kale. The memory of it tasted strange, familiar, and distant, as though dredged from a forgotten dream. His heartbeat was a drum against his ribs, each beat loud enough to drown the hum of energy running through the chamber's walls. Empress Lyra's eyes softened, the steel in them bending beneath the weight of old grief. When she spoke, her voice carried a resonance that made the guards avert their gazes. You remember him, she said quietly. Kale Morks, my husband. Samuel swallowed hard, the sound sharp in the silence. Yes, he admitted. His voice felt too small, too fragile for the enormity of the moment. 5 years ago, the real crisis. The Empress inclined her head, the subtle glow of her crown shimmering with each movement. He never spoke of the details, she said, only that he prevented a war no one else could see coming. That you were there. Samuel nodded once, unable to stop the flood of memory now clawing its way to the surface. The sterile glow of the neutral zone, the heated arguments over Veilian, honor and human pragmatism, the moment Kale had clasped his shoulder and said, You understand more than you should. And that's why I trust you. But none of that explained this. Why a little girl stood before him speaking words no stranger should know. Zara stepped closer, her small face glowing with certainty. "Daddy told me about you," she said softly. "In my dreams," Samuel blinked. "Dreams," he echoed, the word flat, meaningless, until she kept speaking. "Every night for 3 months," she said. "You teach me human words. You tell me about oceans and snow and ice cream." Her mouth curved in a smile so innocent it hurt to look at. "You said it's the happiest food ever made." Samuel's breath hitched. He had said that on a quiet night during the real mission, leaning against a fractured bulkhead, while Cale listened with amused disbelief. He remembered explaining flavors, cold sweetness melting on the tongue. He remembered Cale's low laugh, his curiosity about human joy. But how could this child know? How could she quote words spoken light years and years away, words shared between two men who should now exist only in memory? He turned sharply to the Empress. "Your Majesty, what are you saying?" Lyra stepped closer, her face calm, but her voice threaded with something that sent a shiver down his spine. "Veilian consciousness is complex," she said slowly. "Our essence is not merely chemical impulses. Under certain conditions, strong bonds, powerful emotion echoes of that essence, can persist beyond death." Samuel stared at her, the meaning hammering into his skull like impact waves. "You're saying," "I'm saying," Lyra interrupted, gently, "that my husband's final thoughts were consumed with 2 things, protecting our daughter and preventing the collapse of the peace he fought so hard to build." Her gaze locked on Samuel's, and somehow those thoughts found their way into Zara. Samuel shook his head, unable to reconcile science with the enormity of what she was telling him. "You believe fragments of his consciousness transferred to her?" "I do not merely believe," Lyra said, her tone like ice breaking. "I have seen it. Memories no child could imagine. Emotions that do not belong to her alone. And most of all," she gestured toward Zara, who stood silently, watching Samuel with violet eyes too deep for her years. "The dreams. They began the night Cale died." Zara tilted her head, her braids glinting in the chamber's light. "Daddy says you can help," she murmured. "That you'll understand." Samuel's throat constricted. He wanted to deny it, to push back against the surreal tide dragging him under. But then Zara spoke again, and the ground dropped away beneath him. "He says you're still brave," she whispered. "Still the man who stood up to Admiral Fizora when everyone else was afraid. Daddy says you'll help me finish what he started." Samuel's vision blurred for a second, a rush of heat stinging his eyes. He remembered that day, the standoff in the real sector, Veilian warships primed for annihilation, and Cale at his side as Samuel had thrown every argument, every ounce of courage he had into diffusing the situation. "Honor isn't about victory, it's about what you protect," he'd said. And Cale had listened. Now, Cale's daughter stood before him, carrying the weight of those words in her small hands like a torch in the dark. Samuel drew in a breath that felt like broken glass. "What do you want from me?" Before Zara could answer, the Empress spoke, her voice low, steady, and heavy with meaning. "To help her separate what is hers from what is not. Cale's memories are bleeding into her identity. If we do nothing, she will grow up unable to know where her father ends and where she begins." Samuel stared at her, then at Zara, this child whose trust shone like starlight, whose innocence was tethered to a dead man's shadow. "How?" he asked, his voice raw. "How do I help?" Lyra's eyes gleamed with something that looked like both fear and faith. "Through a process our kind has guarded for centuries, memory sharing." Her words fell like stones into a deep well. "But for it to work, we need you." Samuel felt the air grow thin. "Why me?" "Because," Lyra said, her gaze never wavering, "the memories she carries are of you." The chamber seemed to shrink around him, the light bending, the silence pressing closer. Zara's voice broke through like a whisper of wind. "Will you help me, Dr. Chun?" Samuel looked at her, at the little girl clutching pieces of a dead father in the hope of two species, and knew his life had just shifted beyond anything he could have imagined. And then Zara smiled, the same fearless, luminous smile that had shattered the room minutes ago, and said, "Daddy says it's your turn to keep the promise." Asterisk, the chamber felt alive. Samuel stood at its threshold, his breath shallow, staring at an architecture that seemed less built and more grown. It curved upward like the inside of a crystal cocoon, its translucent walls pulsing faintly with veins of soft light. The glow wasn't static, it shimmered in rhythm, like a heartbeat too slow for human senses. Every surface hummed with a sound just on the edge of hearing, a note that vibrated in the bones more than the ears. The Veilian attendants moved in silence, their long limbs trailing ceremonial sashes that floated in the charged air. They placed slender rods into sockets around the platform, at the center of the chamber, 12 in all, forming a perfect circle that thrummed with contained power. When the last rod locked in place, the floor shimmered as if the fabric of reality had rippled. Samuel swallowed hard. "You call this safe?" His voice cracked slightly, and he hated how small it sounded against the chamber's vast stillness. "Empress." Lyra's voice flowed to him like calm water. "Safe for her," she said, her gaze flicking toward the small figure standing barefoot on the platform. Zara. She looked impossibly fragile in the midst of all this alien ritual, her braids threaded with silver, her violet eyes luminous in the strange light, yet there was no fear in her face, only anticipation. "The process is precise," Lyra continued. "But to complete it, we need the anchor point. We need you." Samuel forced a breath past the constriction in his throat. "Because these memories, what she carries, they all tie back to me?" Lyra's expression softened with something that might have been sorrow. "You were his bridge," she said, "between our worlds. His trust in you was absolute. It is through that trust his thoughts found a path." Samuel felt his pulse pound harder at the mention of Kale. The name struck like a bell in his chest, reverberating through layers of memory. A Veilian officer's sharp laughter, his unyielding calm under fire, the rare warmth of companionship, in a galaxy divided by protocols and fear. And now those echoes lived on in this child. Dr. Velnara, the consciousness specialist, stepped forward. Her skin bore intricate patterns that shifted faintly with the light, her long fingers clasping a small lattice of glowing strands that seemed to hum when she spoke. "You will not be harmed," she said, her tone clinical but tinged with reverence. "But you may experience disorientation. Our minds are not designed to hold two perspectives at once. You will see through your own memories." "And through?" "His." Samuel's stomach turned. "His?" "The fragments residing within Zara," Velnara replied. "What remains of Kale Morks?" Samuel's breath caught. He turned toward Zara. She met his gaze with a smile so gentle it felt like sunlight, breaking through storm clouds. "It's okay," she said. Her voice, small and steady, carried more faith than Samuel had ever felt in himself. "Daddy says you'll be fine." The word slid under his skin like a current of electricity. "Daddy says." It should have sounded absurd. It didn't. Lyra approached him, her robes whispering across the crystalline floor. When she stopped, the glow from the circle painted her face in violet fire. "Samuel," she said quietly, dropping his title for the first time, "you can walk away. No law binds you to this. But if you do, my daughter will never untangle who she is from who her father was. She will grow up in pieces." Samuel looked at Zara again, at the hope shining in her eyes, the weight of two worlds resting in the tilt of her small shoulders. And he thought of Kale, his laughter, his certainty, his voice saying, "You understand more than you should." And that's why I trust you. Samuel stepped forward. The platform pulsed as his boots crossed its surface, threads of light coiling like living things beneath the crystal. He moved until he stood opposite Zara, her tiny hand reaching for his without. Hesitation. He hesitated just for a heartbeat, then took it. Her skin was cool, soft. And then the hum in the air surged, resonating through his bones. Begin, Lyra commanded softly. Dr. Velnara's hands danced over the rods, weaving patterns of light that rippled outward. The circle brightened, and suddenly the air was heavy, thick with something Samuel couldn't name: energy, or memory, or both. His thoughts, once private, felt like doors cracking open. A voice brushed the edge of his mind, clear as a whisper, yet impossibly intimate. Hello, Samuel. Samuel's breath stuttered. It wasn't Zara's voice. Not entirely. It carried weight, timbre familiar in a way that punched the air from his lungs. Kale, Samuel whispered. His vision blurred, then fractured. Reality tilted. Suddenly, he was standing in two places at once. A memory surged like a tidal wave. The command deck during the real crisis. Lights flashing crimson, alarms screaming. He saw himself arguing with Admiral Thesora, his voice raw, with urgency. Honor isn't victory, it's what you protect. He felt Kale beside him, a wall of silent strength. And at the same time, he felt Kale's perspective, watching a human diplomat risk everything with nothing but words and raw conviction. Feeling something bloom that no Veilian language could name, Samuel gasped, his knees almost buckling under. The dual weight of the moment. God, he choked, gripping Zara's hand harder. I can feel him. Zara's mental voice brushed his again, warmer now. Me too. Sometimes I'm me. Sometimes I'm Daddy missing his friend. The chamber spun with overlapping realities, midnight conversations about duty and joy. Kale's bewildered fascination with ice cream. Laughter shared over concepts alien to both their worlds. And then, beneath it all, a final fragment surfaced raw, aching and fierce as a heartbeat. If I don't return, tell him not to let the bridge burn. Tell him to keep her safe. The force of it stole Samuel's breath. Tears burned his eyes before he could stop them. Zara squeezed his hand, her small voice a fragile thread in the storm. Will you help me, Samuel? And he heard the echo of another voice, Kale's, overlapping hers, binding past and present into one impossible plea. Promise me. Samuel closed his eyes, his heart a drumbeat of certainty. Yes, he whispered into the humming light. I promise. Asterisk, the hum faded into silence, but the silence felt deeper than before, charged, almost trembling. The circle of rods dimmed, their light settling into a slow pulse like a heartbeat. At rest, Samuel stood with his hands still clasped in Zara's, his breathing uneven, as if the air itself had thickened during the ritual. He felt hollow and full at the same time. The torrent of borrowed memories had receded, but their echoes lingered in his bones, flashes of starlit decks, a taste of tension in the real crisis command room, and the sound of Kale's voice low, calm, filled with the conviction Samuel now understood had been more than duty. The Empress approached silently, her robes trailing ribbons of light on the crystalline floor. Her eyes searched his face, their violet depths holding both hope and fear. It's done? She asked softly. Samuel swallowed hard, his throat raw. Not entirely, he said, his voice catching. There's something more. Something he wanted me to hear. Zara turned to him, her small hand tightening around his fingers. You heard it too, she said, her voice a whisper and a promise. Daddy's last words. Samuel looked at her, and then back at Lyra. He took a steadying breath that didn't steady him at all. He told me, if he didn't come back, not to let the bridge burn. Samuel's voice trembled as the weight of the phrase sank into him. He said to keep her safe, and to keep what we built alive. Lyra's face, always so perfectly composed, cracked at the edges. A tremor crossed her lips before she mastered it, but her eyes betrayed the depth of her grief. "That was Cale," she said, her voice like glass under strain. Always thinking beyond himself, beyond the moment. Samuel wanted to speak, to offer some scrap of comfort, but the next surge of memory hit like a tidal wave, not visual this time, but visceral. A feeling so sharp it felt like someone else's heartbeat, pounding through his own chest, the fierce certainty that this human mattered more than Cale had ever admitted aloud. Samuel staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the platform for balance. "There's something else," he murmured, barely aware he'd spoken until both Lyra and Zara fixed their gazes on him. "What is it?" Lyra asked, asterisk. The first light of Centralis Prime crept over the crystalline spires like molten gold, igniting the sky in fire and promise. Dawn on the imperial capital was never quiet hovercraft, humming through the morning haze, the low thrum of atmospheric shields, but inside the throne hall, silence reigned. For once, it wasn't a silence of judgment. It was reverence. Jackson stood before the great dais, the weight of centuries pressing down from every gleaming surface. The hall soared like a cathedral to the stars, its walls alive with rivers of light, constellations dancing in liquid crystal. Arcs. Beyond the open vault of the ceiling, the twin suns rose together, spilling radiance over the Empire's heart. And every eye, every human, every alien noble, every armored sentinel was on him. The coronation dais rose from the floor like a living thing, petals of luminous alloy unfurling around him in slow majesty. On the highest step waited the imperial crown, a circlet of silver and obsidian, set with shards of crystal that pulsed faintly, as if sensing the bloodline returned. 1 year ago, he'd been a boy choking on Martian dust. Now the galaxy knelt. He should have felt fear, maybe even pride. Instead, all he felt was the absence of her. His gaze flicked instinctively to the shadows along the hall's edge, to the warriors of the Zarati Dominion standing rigid as statues, their black armor gleaming. And then she stepped forward. Tha Sarah Vex. Gone was the battle armor that had terrified entire systems. Today she wore ceremonial raiment, wrought from layers of obsidian silk and crimson energy thread, flowing like molten fire around her towering frame. Her markings shimmered silver bright, catching every glint of starlight pouring through the vault. A circlet, not a warrior's helm, but a diadem of interlaced alloy crowned her midnight hair. She moved with the same predator grace, but something in her stride had changed, softer, freer, and God's help him. Jackson thought he'd never seen anything so breathtaking. The murmurs rippled through the chamber, like a shockwave as she climbed. The steps not to stand behind him, as law dictated, but beside him. Equal height, equal presence. Gasps broke from the gathered nobles. Axis, the imperial AI, flickered into being above the dais in a cascade of geometric light. By decree of the succession protocol, it intoned, "The bond forged 1 galactic cycle past dissolves with this dawn. The regent consort may know." The word cracked through the hall like a plasma bolt. Every head turned to the Sara, her voice rolling like distant thunder. There will be no dissolution. The chamber erupted. Voices clashed like blades, protests, questions, outrage, but she silenced them with a single sweep of her molten gaze. Then she spoke, each word a blade of iron. "The law bound me to this union for a year. That year ends today." She turned to Jackson, and the heat in her eyes could have melted the throne itself. "But I choose to remain not as a consort, not as a prize, but as Empress, as his partner. By my will, not your codes?" Gasps turned to stunned silence. Axis pulsed. Wildly, lines of light fracturing in confusion. This proceeding does not exist in Imperial statute. Jackson stepped forward, his voice steady as steel. Then write it. Today, the old empire dies here. A new one begins built, not on chains of law, but on choice. For a breathless second, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Then one by one, figures knelt first the Zara warriors, dropping like falling shadows, fists over their hearts. Then the human legates, the Androsian guildmasters, the fractal beings of the Veil collective all, bending the knee beneath the sky blazing. With Dawn-Fire. Jackson felt the weight of 1,000 worlds settle on his shoulders, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. He reached for the crown. It was cold as starlight as he lifted it, every crystal flaring like a captured sun. But when he turned, it wasn't the galaxy he looked at. It was her .THA Sarah. And as he placed the diadem on his head, he spoke not to the nobles, not to Axis, but to the woman who had changed everything. Together, he whispered. 6 months later, Samuel Chun stood on the same crystalline platform where everything had changed, but the chamber felt different now. Gone was the suffocating tension, the hum of fear and uncertainty. Today, the air was bright with laughter. Zara twirled in the center of the room, her braids catching shards of light from the refractive walls. "Higher, Samuel," she commanded, her voice ringing like music through the vast space. "You're not doing it right." Samuel grinned, crouched low with his arms out, moving in exaggerated arcs. "This is how you make snow angels," he sighed, panting slightly. "Except on Earth, there's actual snow instead of holographic frost." He nodded at the white simulation glowing under their feet, a marvel of Veilian tech conjuring ice crystals that shimmered but never melted. Zara collapsed into a giggle, falling back into the faux snow and sweeping her arms wide, leaving a perfect glowing silhouette. "It feels real enough," she declared. "Happiness activity achieved?" Samuel laughed, shaking his head. "That's not what we call it. We just call it fun." The soft sound of amusement floated from the dais where Empress Lyra sat, her robes cascading like living auroras around her. "Happiness activity," she repeated, violet eyes warm with pride. "Perhaps a phrase worth keeping, Dr. Chun." "Samuel," he corrected gently, something he never would have dared 6 months ago. But the Empress only smiled because they weren't ruler and envoy anymore. Not really. The weight of titles had thinned, replaced by something deeper. Trust. Born from grief, hope, and choices neither of them had expected to make. The formal session had ended an hour ago. It had taken all of 3 minutes for Zara to shift from princess to child on a mission, dragging Samuel toward the simulation controls. Lyra had indulged them both. Watching with an expression, Samuel had come to know maternal pride mixed with something quieter, something she rarely spoke of. Now, as Zara carved imaginary snow angels with abandon, Lyra rose from the dais and crossed the chamber. She moved like light spilling through glass, every motion fluid, every step silent. When she reached him, Samuel straightened instinctively, an old reflex, but she touched his arm lightly, a signal that formality was unnecessary. "The council approved every clause," she said softly, her voice carrying an undertone of awe. "Trade, research exchange, cultural programs all ratified. Your ambassador says the alliance will redefine half the quadrant." Samuel exhaled a laugh, part disbelief, part relief. "I never thought I'd see the day when human informality and Veilian precision ended up in the same treaty." Lyra's lips curved. "It seems," she said, glancing toward Zara, "that a child's dreams succeeded where diplomats could not." Samuel followed her gaze. Zara had rolled over and was now building what looked suspiciously like a snow fort. She didn't just dream, he murmured. She remembered. The Empress's eyes softened, the violet in them glowing like deep space starlight. And now she is learning to separate what is hers from what was her father's. She hesitated, then added quietly, "Because of you." Samuel shook his head. Because of Kale. Lyra didn't deny it. "And yet," she said gently, "you stayed." He looked at her, then really looked, and the words came before he could stop them. "I didn't stay for duty." Something unspoken passed between them, brief and bright as a comet's arc, before Zara's delighted cry shattered the moment. "Look, biggest snow angel in the galaxy." She waved her arms wildly, sending particles of light scattering like tiny stars. Samuel chuckled, walking toward her, but stopped when a soft chime sounded from his wrist slate. A message encrypted, Veilian coded, bearing a date that made his pulse stutter. 6 months old, his breath caught. Slowly he opened it. The holographic projection was small, flickering, but the voice was unmistakable. Low, resonant, carrying. A warmth that gripped Samuel's chest like a hand. Kale, if you're hearing this, the recording began. Then I didn't come home. And if Zara has my dreams, and so does my trust, Samuel, protect them both. Show her the stars the way I couldn't. And if fate allows. A voice hesitated, almost faltering something Kale had never done in life. Don't live alone. My last gift to you is a family, if you choose it. The message ended with a flicker of light, leaving silence in its wake. Samuel stood rooted, the words burning through him like fire on frozen ground. Across the chamber, Zara looked up, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Samuel, are you coming?" He closed the slate slowly, his throat thick, his heart pounding with something fierce and certain. He crossed to her, scooping her up in a spin that made her laugh so loudly it filled every hollow in his soul. "Yes, Princess," he said softly, holding her close as the Empress watched with quiet eyes that shone like dawn. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in years, Samuel Chun knew exactly who he was and where he belonged, not as a diplomat, not as a bridge, but as part of a promise that had reached across life and death, across worlds and war, and built something stronger than treaties. A family chosen in defiance of every boundary. The universe had drawn as Zara curled her arms around his neck, whispering, "We'll make the biggest snow angels on Earth, right?" Samuel smiled, his voice steady now. "Right," he said. "Together." Outside the chamber, the twin suns of Veil Prime climbed the horizon, spilling light across the spires of the capital like rivers of fire. And in the heart of the empire, a man who had once come as a stranger stood anchored by bonds that not even death could sever. Kale had been right. The bridge hadn't burned. It had become a home. *The end.